It is really a personal pleasure for me to have the honor of introducing Jim Mann, to this very distinguished audience. Jim and I go back a long time. We were together during a rather exciting phase in China, in the history of China. We were there, well, I was there with him for 3 years, I think, 83 to 86. But Jim stayed on till the second Tiananmen incident, and has written about it, his own experiences. And during the time that we were there, we became very close friends, had a lot of exchanges about what China was all about, what was happening in China. Then, as it happens in our profession, both his profession as well as my profession, we sort of lost contact. And then suddenly one day I received an email from Jim saying that he wanted to come to India and see what India is all about after having seen what China is all about. There he is. And it has been a signal pleasure for me to reconnect with him. And for me and my wife to reconnect with Carolyn, his wonderful wife. And it's really a tremendous opportunity for us to sit down and exchange notes about the many years that we have been apart. But actually picking up the pieces again was, or at least for me, was very easy. So, Jim, welcome to India. Jim is, of course, I think you would have read the short bio that has been given. It is really a short bio because he has a much longer bio if you really want to know what all that he has been involved with. But he's written several books, and the books particularly relevant to his China experience is, of course, The Peking Jeep, which is about the experiences of American companies in China. He has written on the China Fantasy, which is essentially about the kind of notions which exist in the United States of America about the evolution of China. He has also written about the different presidents of the United States. Can we not have the musical accompaniment, please? So he has also written, as I said, about the policies of the different presidents from Nixon to Clinton was the period that he covered in the book that he's written about face, and which I read very carefully. I remember when it came out, and he has a very good way of encapsulating what I think is still a running theme as far as US approach to China is concerned, one which he calls the soothing scenario. And the soothing scenario is one in which China is naturally going to evolve, particularly with higher living standards, with the growth of its economy, with its integration with the global economy. The soothing scenario is that China would become, at least for the US, a country like us. And if it becomes a country like us, then of course, it is very easy to deal with China. The not so soothing scenario is the upheaval scenario, which he has also talked about, which is that soon the contradictions between the growth of the economy, middle class expanding, standards of living rising, people wanting not just the good things of life, but also wanting to have freedom, to have democracy, to think for themselves. And this contradiction will soon come to a point where it will be impossible to sustain this contradiction between still a totalitarian state and a society which has gone in a different direction altogether. And that would pose different kinds of challenges. And there are, of course, several scenarios in between. But I think what Jim has done is to really put forward this dilemma that the United States has in how to deal with ascendant China. he has not a very shall I say a view of U.S. negotiators that would inspire much confidence, because he feels that in one book he has written that the American officials have been constantly outmaneuvered and out-negotiated by the by the Chinese. Sometimes such charges are made against Indian diplomats as well, but that's another story. Um, so, how the United States today will deal with China? United States, where in Jim's words, there is a president, and perhaps who's reflecting the current state of the United States, whose view of the world, he says, is more modest and downbeat. If that is the sense of how the American administration is looking at the world, what does it mean in terms of U.S. policy or U.S. approach to China? I think we have no person better than Jim, who has made the study of China a certain passion for himself over the last 30 years. No better person than him to really tell us about what his perspective is on what is going to be a, I think, enduring challenge for the world, not just for India and the US, but for the world for the next decades. Jim, you have the floor. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Shyam, and thank you all for coming. I think as my starting point, I want to highlight a couple of propositions which have come through to you in the newspapers and in general in what's been written about China, but to summarize where we are now in China's relationship with the world. And the first is that over the past 30 years, China has made what is probably the most rapid economic transformation of any country, certainly in modern times and maybe in history. And to bring that home to you, to put it in more personal terms, I want to look back in 1984, 29 years ago, when the two of us were in China. Deng Xiaoping announced the beginning of the urban reforms. Most people date Deng Xiaoping's reforms to 79, but really the initial 5 years were devoted to the countryside. In 84, in the fall of 1984, a new series of reforms were announced, and to boil a lot down to put it simply, this was deciding that prices would be allowed to fluctuate and that China would open up to private businessmen. And to give you a sense of where China was at the time, the weekend after these reforms were announced, I went out to the main shopping district, Wangfujing, and went in the main department store where refrigerators were on sale. And there were lined up perhaps 20 refrigerators, and 19 of them looked exactly the same, and they were priced at 900 yuan. I forget then, but it was about $200. And then there was a 20th there that had clearly been returned, and it had dents in it, 2 or 3 inch dents, and it had markings up and down. And people went in there and said, "What will you take for this?" which was itself radical. No one had ever done that before, really, or been allowed to do that. And the store, in what it thought was a radical move, said, "All the others are 900, this one is 897. That was China 29 years ago. And private businessmen, I can remember the first guy I met on the streets of Beijing who was going to open up his own photo store. Private businessmen 29 years ago meant that really it was individual people taking a leap on their own. And really for the first 5 years, private businessmen were the people down and out in Chinese society. Reporters love the kind of, the times they ask questions and get something back that's totally different from what they expected. In 1987, I was in Guangzhou, and Guangzhou had just opened what was one of the first and model AIDS, anti-STD or anti-AIDS clinics. And I asked to interview the clinic. Well, they gave me a vice mayor, an official, to see instead. And so I began to ask about the program, kind of wrote programs and said, what's the target population that your programs are aiming at? Expecting an answer like kids from age 18 to 38 or something like that. And he said, mostly good-to-who, which meant private businessmen. And I did a double take and said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you know, they're not in individual work units. We can't control them. So they're the suspect population. That was roughly what a private businessman meant in the 80s. Over the 90s, they developed a new model of a private businessman. By the mid-90s, usually the brother or son or nephew of a senior military or Communist Party leader, and the private business that he was engaged in was something like the entire decentralized telecommunications agency. So over a period of 30 years, where is China now? Well, now, economically, China is the point. To take a few recent stories, in the last few weeks, one of Britain's butler training services just announced that it was going to open up in China because there was a greater need for butlers in China, it appeared, than there is in Britain. And there was another story in The Economist which compared the financial clout of the legislators, members of parliament in the United States and in China, and China's members of what's China's National People's Congress were vastly wealthier than any of the members of Congress. So China has developed in ways that we see every day to the point where economically it is rivaling or surpassing the West. And at the same time, over the past 30 years, China has made stunningly little change of any fundamental change in its political system. So in the 1980s, even when I left at the end of the 80s, there were reformers in China talking very excitedly about intermediate steps, not abolishing one-party rule, not full-scale democracy, but maybe increasing press scrutiny, maybe having some legislative oversight. And you can pick up the newspapers today. They are exactly where they were really 30 years ago. There's amazingly little that has happened. And that brings me to the third development, which is as China's economic powers increase, obviously, it has begun to develop its military power in order to protect its economic interests. So we are now seeing China very active in places like the South China Sea, as India sees developing facilities at Gwador, and so on. And so the question is, if you have a country which is this wealthy and yet hasn't changed politically, what's the policy response? And I guess I would say that throughout this period, most of this period, the United States has had what I would call the integrationist model for response to China as a great power. It's the integrationist model that I criticize in this book, The China Fantasy, because I thought it didn't work. And really, there's a part of the book that argues, as Shyam said, that increasing wealth and trade and investment are not automatically going to bring China to political liberalization. That's kind of a tenet of faith among American policymakers. But the other part of the American model for China was that China would, the United States would bring China into the world's international order without China seeking major changes in it. That the United States would gradually introduce China almost as a big brother. And the words I think that I guess probably American policy makers liked the least from this book were, in a way, the American approach is a bit patronizing to China. It sounds as if the United States is a weary, experienced trainer bringing China to a diplomatic version of obedience school. But that was the American model. What interests me is that in the 6 years since that book has come out, there have been significant changes on both sides. So on the side of the United States, I would say that integrationist model has begun to wear out. American leaders have stopped talking as though American policy is going to gradually bring China to political liberalization, and have really begun to wonder now whether China is going to enter the international order without seeking to change it. And why have American policies started to change? They started to change in response to China's policies, I think. There's been a fundamental change, I would say, between 2008 and 2010. In 2008, you had the financial crisis. China seems to have done a strategic reassessment and decided that the United States was a declining power and that China should assert its power more, that it really didn't need to accept the terms that it had been operating with the United States. And really, in 2009, you had the coming together of China assuming that the United States was in decline, and a new administration, the Barack Obama administration, taking office really thinking that they would pick up with China where the Clinton administration had left off. And throughout 2009, you had China saying, we don't want the president to meet with the Dalai Lama, at least it would disturb the harmony of President Obama's first trip to Beijing. When Obama went to Beijing, China controlled the trip in such a way that it was a radical change from even what Bill Clinton had been allowed to do 10 years earlier. There were proposals, and the United States kept asking, well, he'd like to have a town hall meeting. Well, that wasn't possible. He'd like to talk to students. That wasn't possible, and so on. Obama, I would suggest, was a little nonplussed by all this. It was a bad trip, and he became a little irritated at what was being brought to him as a China policy. He is sort of less committed to what I would call the sort of Clinton Wall Street view of international relations, and more inclined to be aggressive in pursuing America's economic interests. And he didn't like what was going on. Meanwhile, on the China side, China is, during this period, beginning to push on the South China Sea, in several different areas, the East China Sea. And finally, by mid-2010, you get a response in which the Obama administration and the United States begins to harden its policies and really not operate on the same assumptions, which is, we don't want to make China too mad, we don't want to provoke them, and so on. It began to toughen its policies. Now, the question, and it's a particularly fair and acute one to ask in India, is this a permanent change? And for India, of course, has seen America's policy come and go, and there's always the concern that, well, in another 18 months or so, there'll be a new American effort to form a G2 with China to work out the economic and security dimensions of Asia. I would say no. I mean, this feels to me like a fairly long-term change in America's policy towards China. That's different from saying that the American rebalancing towards China, rebalancing policy towards Asia is itself the full response, because I still don't know yet what the Obama policies are going to be, how much they're going to put into this particular policies. I'm talking in the longer term. I think there's been a change in American thinking and a change in America's approach towards China. Meanwhile, there's been a change in China, and to be quick about it, I call it the sort of trilogy of Chinese middle-class concerns, which are raising new questions about long-term stability in China. So at the time I wrote the book, it seemed to me that China's middle class was bought off, that middle-class people were getting enough trips and enough privileges and so on, that they were not going to make trouble for the regime. Over the last 6 years, I've been impressed with China's middle-class concerns on 3 areas. One, air quality. So you're starting to see in leading Chinese cities, people want to leave the cities, young, sort of upper middle class Chinese wanting to get out of the country for a while. The air quality has been not just bad. I mean, I read the readings here in Delhi, vastly worse than that. And one of the most important things that the United States has resisted Chinese pressure on in the last 10 years or more is this. The U.S. Embassy began posting simply the pollution readings for Beijing on its own website, and suddenly it got more hits and more tweets, just what the air quality was, than anyone could have believed. And the Chinese came to the American embassy and said, this was not right, and this was readings only at the embassy, and wouldn't you change this because it's hurting the feelings of the Chinese people? And the United States stuck to its guns, and finally the Chinese relented, stopped complaining about this, and began to start posting accurate pollution readings. So that's one. The second is food quality, product quality. So there have been, as you've read, scandals over the last 7 or 8 years where basic milk for kids is tainted, and people are importing milk from Hong Kong, from overseas, because they can't trust anything they buy. And the third is internet censorship, which just comes as kind of a daily annoyance and insult to middle-class people, who why does someone have to tell me what I can read and what's going to affect my views? And because of that, I now see the Chinese middle class is not quite so bought off as it seemed about 6 or 7 years ago. But having said that, to return to China as a great power, we now have still an economically powerful country developing greater and greater military capabilities, with a political system which is ever more fragile, I think. And yet, I think the Chinese have developed the tools of suppression, whether it's for demonstrations, whether it's for internet censorship, to prevent any large-scale political upheaval. And so this is the prospect for the next 20 years or so. The question is the extent to which a China which is nervous about its internal stability is going to change its overseas policies. Is it going to, in some way, be more aggressive overseas? Is it going to be concerned about its own internal weakness? That is the question that I can't answer, but I think in my view, as before, China is not about to change politically. It's going to get stronger and stronger economically. Maybe Shyam can talk about that. There are questions about that. And one way or another, we are going to have to deal with this China and all its contradictions, but without serious change for the next 20 years or so.
Jim, thank you very much for your very perceptive assessment of what we can expect in the next several years in respect of China's evolution. You mentioned that in 2009, there was certainly an effort to try and see whether China and the United States could work out some kind of a global understanding with each other, which at that time, I remember we used to say that there is a G2 which is,
Right.
which is coming into existence. And I can certainly confirm that there was a degree of apprehension in India. You will notice that the joint statement which was worked out for Obama's visit to Beijing, in fact, preceded Obama's actual arrival in Beijing. And if you look at that joint statement, it is incredible how out of sync it is with what actually happened during the visit. Because in a sense, that joint statement was, in fact, the blueprint which had been worked out, at least as far as people like Steinberg were concerned, as what is going to be the future cooperative relationship between China and the United States. And there was this term called strategic reassurance for each other. And yet, as you mentioned, Obama had a very rather painful visit to China. And then I think we realized that perhaps China had overreached itself, had gone a bit too far with its assessment that here is a great power which is in decline. It is in hock to China because of the treasury certificates that it had bought over the last several years. You don't fight or you don't quarrel with your creditor, as
That
they
was
say.
Hillary's line, yes.
But the interesting thing from the Indian perspective was, I recall that we were supposed to go to Washington for our Prime Minister's visit, a state visit to Washington. And the general sense here was, although the Obama administration was really laying out the red carpet and there was going to be a grand banquet, but this was essentially a consolation prize visit. Not to get the Indians too worried about what was happening between US and China. And that was the expectation with which many Indian analysts looked at the visit. And yet, when we arrived in Washington, and I recall the meeting that took place between President Obama and the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, what could have been a exchange of pleasantries actually became a very substantive conversation and a fairly long conversation about the kind of challenges that the United States would be confronting in this region, in particular the rise of China. Yes, both sides did emphasize that there is no alternative to engagement with China and working out some kind of an understanding with China, but that we also have to be prepared that we have a very different security situation which is developing in the region. And that I ascribe to precisely the kind of experience that Obama faced in Beijing. You will recall that in the joint statement, there was also a reference to US and China having certain common interests with regard to South Asia, and that they would work together with respect to peace and stability in the region. which we were very, very upset and angry about. And this was very quickly put aside. And in another context, soon after that, we went to Copenhagen for the climate summit. And the situation there was entirely different. Because until then, in the climate change negotiations, I always found that even though China was taking much harder positions, I would say much harsher positions, willing to give much less, the US response was, well, yes, there is a problem, but at least China is recognizing the problem, at least it is trying to do something about it. There was very little patience with India. India was a bad boy. India was standing in this process of trying to reach some agreement. And yet when we went to Copenhagen, India receded to the background. The bad boy was, was China. And it was all throughout that summit, the focus of the United States and its allies was on how negative and how obstructive the Chinese were being. And we could see that in the reaction of the Chinese to this situation. I think they were a little bewildered by this change in the atmosphere. And that is when we found that in the conversations that our Prime Minister had with the Chinese Prime Minister, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Where he was, one of the first things which he said was, that reference to South Asia in the Sino-US joint statement, we were not responsible for it. It was the Americans who wanted it. But I mean, this is just to confirm the point that you were making, that was in a sense a turning point. But having said that, and you said that, is this change for real? Is that going to be enduring? There is still skepticism in India. And the reason why I draw attention to that is because you yourself said, and I mentioned in my opening remarks, that here is a president who's more modest and downbeat. If this president is more modest and downbeat, how does that reflect in terms of how the United States is going to engage with China? Engage with China at a time when the United States, still the most powerful country in the world, but perhaps aware of the limitations of power and the limitations on the exercise of power, how is it going to deal with this rising ascendant power, which is becoming more assertive? And what role does the United States see in terms of where India fits into this larger picture? Our view always has been, if there is a convergence between India and the US with respect to the security situation in this region, it is because India will do, for its own reasons, what is necessary to safeguard its security. And that just happens to be convergent with US interests. India will not likely become a subordinate ally of the United States. And the US perhaps finds it difficult to adjust to that relationship. The US is comfortable dealing with adversaries, very comfortable dealing with allies. I'm not so sure that this new animal of a partner is something that the US has been able to adjust to. Although I would still say that in the engagement that we have had with the United States over the last several years, there has been a mutual learning process. Instead of talking past each other, I think we have at least started talking to each other. But I think how we decide to deal with this new situation in the region is going to be important for India. It's going to be important for the United States. Any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, on the changes, let's take it through three presidents. The Clinton administration, which you can use as sort of the starting point for these purposes, for China and India policy. Clinton administration is governing at a time of prosperity. It goes to China in 1998. Clinton had been trying to find a way to go to China as the first American president to visit after Tiananmen. And we could in a separate session, talk for 2 or 3 hours about nuclear developments in 1998. But the language that they worked out, that's kind of basically said the US and China will work together to monitor developments on the subcontinent, was, whatever you think of it, was a reaction to that. I had problems with it at the time and said so. But it was based in something. Then you go to a few events in the world happened between 1998 and 2009. And not just in the world and not just in Pakistan or the World Trade Center or anything else, but also George Bush's relationship with India. And then a new administration comes in which the China experts come from the Clinton administration. Don't really worry about America's economic interests because they didn't have to worry about them in the 90s, to exaggerate a little bit. And they've done this this language before, and so they'd say, they're really dealing with the China of 1998, the India of 1998. It was like, what planet are you guys coming from? And, to Obama's credit, he does begin to react to his own people, producing a change in policy. So, then the question is, I actually think that when I speak of Obama's interest in a more modest, in their words, more modest footprint in the world, I'm really talking about, especially about the Middle East. I don't think that applies. I don't think that applies to China, to Asia, except that, of course, the United States is going to have fewer resources in general. That's just, that's overall reality. But beginning in 2011 with this announced rebalancing, but really from the beginning of the administration, their thinking was, we need to devote much more time and attention to Asia. So now you raise the question, so what happens if you've got less resources? I still think that doesn't lead to a renewed strategy of the old relationship with China. I just don't see how that happens. I think, and you've seen it and mentioned it, that it does mean stronger relationships, but not alliances, with countries like India, and strengthened alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and that will be the heart of American strategy. And of course, this fits into the old question of an American hedging strategy, but I think that's really what it is. That is, it's developing relationships now while you wait and see how things turn out in China. As far as India's, trying to dominate India, I'm not sure we're going to see. I'm sure you up close see that all the time, but I don't.
No, I was not suggesting that the United States is trying to dominate India, but what I wanted to suggest was that there is a strong, I see it personally, I see a strong convergence in US interests and Indian interests. But it is a convergence which will have to be pursued in a somewhat different manner than it is pursued, say, with an ally, or a difference in interest pursued with an adversary. Just on the issue of the US rebalancing to Asia, 2 or 3 things worry us. One is that, if you spoke about Clinton, but one very important incident during Clinton's presidency was, the crisis in the Taiwan Straits. Mm-hmm. And you recall that the US response was very swift, was very decisive, and China had to back off.
Right.
Of course, they said, Never again will we allow this to happen to us again. But they had to climb down. The general sense I find in the region is that should that happen today, we may not see the same US response. That is one. Second is, if you take, for example, the relationship with a country like Philippines, and you saw the incident of the Scarborough Shoal. Now, the US response was, don't get into a confrontation, let's try and solve this diplomatically, and the US played a role in trying to sort this out, and yet, when the US went back into the background, what have the Chinese done? They have fenced off the shoal. The Philippines does not have access to that. So effectively, despite an US role to try and diffuse this, you have a Chinese changing the situation on the ground. Even if you talk to the Japanese, for whom the alliance with the United States is absolutely fundamental. Yet, with respect to what is happening around the Senkaku Islands, the Japanese are not very clear as to what the US response would be, in fact, if there is a confrontation which develops. Because the US advice to Japan is, don't provoke, don't get into a fight. So this is, in a sense, if you're looking at even a Clinton administration, which is in a sense a kind of a benchmark for the Obama administration. In fact, there is a much more robust posture that we saw in the region by Clinton, which it is anticipated may not be the same in today's situation. Do you feel that there is a change?
Well, so let me react on each of those. On the Taiwan, what would happen if 1995, if it happened again? I was going to say it depends what it is. If the answer is China were to probe and test the situation by firing missiles in the Taiwan Straits, I'm not sure that the reaction would be that. I don't think that the specific American reaction would necessarily be to send ships into the Straits. I think if it meant seriously threatening to take control of Taiwan, I think that the American reaction would be the same. Where the same is not necessarily a ship, but that it would react militarily if necessary. Now, having said that, and this is relevant to both the Philippines and to Japan, this is not new policy. Long-standing American policy is to not give a blank check to allies. And to leave unclear what it will do. Specifically in the question of Taiwan, there's a policy that dates back to the 1950s called strategic ambiguity, which is you don't say exactly how you will react to exactly what. And I think when you get to the Senkakus, I think there's a version of the American strategic ambiguity policy with regard to that, because because of the disputes on over the Senkakus and sovereignty, they don't want to give Japan a blank check. And that applies in the Philippines, except I would, and I agree with you that China ended up with gains there. The rest, I agree with all that. The rest of the story is that as a result, the Philippines is looking for, and the U.S. seems to be open to further military relationship between the Philippines and the United States.
Okay. Last question before I throw in the floor to questions. The new administration in China, the new leadership, the last visit by Xi Jinping to Washington, and the talk about a new type of great power relationship, which seemed to suggest a Chinese version of the G2, different from maybe the US version,
Right.
but something similar to that. How much does the United States buy into that concept? I mean, is it something which
It's, you know,
the US sees as perhaps something which could be a basis on which to work a relationship with China in the coming years?
I don't think so. That seems to me a Chinese, you know, you spoke before about formulations that have no basis beyond the words that they're written on. I continue to see you know, out of the Chinese press and out of, you know, a new version, I mean, a new type of great power relationship. But I don't see any impact of that or takers for American policy.
Okay, that's clear enough. Okay, so Jim will, I'm sure, take questions from you. May I request you to be brief with your question? Please identify yourself and the organization that you represent. And what I'll do is maybe take 2 or 3 questions together and then request Jim to give his response. Yes?
Jill Dipankar Banerjee, representing the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. What are the principal concerns of the permanent members of the Politburo, Standing Committee of the Politburo? What are the issues that keep them awake at night today, essentially regarding the internal developments within China?
Are there any other questions relating to the internal Chinese situation, or all the others are on foreign policy? Yes, please.
We can start it. I represent an industrial group which operates in India and China. The question is that, just picking it up from the previous question, that there is a new Chinese dream, quote unquote. So we'd like to have some views from you on the new stated Chinese dream of the new team of the Politburo.
Any other questions on the internal situation? Bhaskar?
So I'm Bhaskar Roy. I do write once in a while on channel, but I'm interested in it. We have seen a new kind of resurgence, somewhat on the leftist, somewhat on the balancing side, after the connected with the Boshilai incident. But at the moment, it seems there is a tussle between 2 factions, how far of economic and how far of political developments or reform can take place. One can feel a palpable tension like it was in the early 80s between the two sides. Can we see how this is going to play out, especially when you said the middle class has not been bought off, and how that role will, what role they will play in the coming few months?
Okay, Jim, why don't you take these questions with
Just
regard to the internal
very
situation?
quickly, what do they worry about in the Politburo? In the general, of course, they worry about internal stability. What does that mean? Of course, they're always worried about spreading strikes or unrest, but that seems to be a problem that they have managed to keep relatively controlled. I mean, they've now had a good, 20 plus years to figure out how to prevent demonstrations in one area from getting too big and spreading elsewhere. They worry, though, about maintaining some kind of public support and popularity for the party. That it almost seems ludicrous from the outside, but they really don't. They realize that the party has very little enthusiasm, even among its own members. And the reason that that's important is that they are worried about losing middle-class support. So they sit there, I think, and worry about how do we open up to change in a controlled way. So, and they do try. So within the last few months, you've seen they're setting up a special zone in Shanghai where there's complete internet freedom. Can you do that in one part of one city? I don't know. They've used special zones before. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes they were a way of preventing change. And then they worry about party unity. So the unity within the party, preventing factions from developing. That was part of the threat of Bo Xilai. They worry about the emergence of any kind of dynamic leader, like some sort of new Gorbachev. And I guess what they worry about, internal stability, I would say, is the greatest problem. That extends to economics. So they worry about divisions within the party on hard, concrete economic issues, economic factions and constituencies opening up within the party. So that's at least part of their concerns.
Okay. Yes, please.
Good evening. My name is Saran Das. I am a research intern for Dr. Shashi Tharoor. My question to you is about environmental diplomacy. Now that there's a mechanism, there's going to be a conference sort of looking into the post-Kyoto mechanism. How do you see China and US progressing towards trying to come about with sort of a mechanism that will create accountability for countries regarding global warming in the years ahead?
I can't be all that optimistic for either country. On the US side, it's interesting because at the beginning of the second term for Obama, I heard a phrase which has become extremely relevant, and the context was global warming. But it was, this administration is going to have a hard time doing anything with this Congress, and we are going to have to develop workarounds. Workarounds meant things you can do by presidential and executive action that don't have to go to Congress. And of course, the entire story of the second Obama term is to try and find workarounds, and they're having a hard time doing it. But the original context of that was to admit that there's very little that they can do with Congress on climate change. China, I tend to be skeptical that we're going to see any far-reaching change from China.
Okay. Let me take
Yeah.
2 or 3 questions before we finish. Professor Sir.
My name is Professor Satish Kumar, formerly from Jawaharlal Nehru University. I think the central point that you made was that with the growth of China's economic power and military power, which will continue, there is not going to be any internal liberalization of the political system. This is what the American assessment is. Now, what kind of impact is it likely to have on China's attitude as far as its assertiveness is concerned, if the assumption is that if China had liberalized internally, made it a more open society, more responsive to aspirations of the people inside, as also presumably the outside world, the assumption would be that China would be more liberal towards the outside world as well and try to resolve its disputes amicably. Whereas the present reality is that China continues to postpone the disputes with the Philippines, with Vietnam, with Japan, with India, and continues to leverage its economic and military enhanced capability. How do you look at that prospect if China continues to be internally very closed society and yet economically and militarily becoming a much more powerful country?
Okay.
My name is Suresh Goel, recently retired Foreign Service Officer. I was surprised that there was a very little discussion in your presentation on the direction that Chinese economy is taking place. And what I would like to know is primarily because economic influence which China exercises in Southeast Asia and in Africa and in other parts of the world has been one major plank of its foreign policy outreach. And over the last 2 decades, at least what I see happening is an excess construction of infrastructural capacity in China, a large part of which remains unutilized. But in the quest for going bigger and bigger, it is happening faster and faster. And at the same time, China has now begun to see the signs of economic, I wouldn't call it slow down, but the GDP is declining, the manufacturing is declining. So against all those factors, how do you see the Chinese economy playing up, not in the next 10 years, but over the next 5 years, let us say?
Okay.
My name is Kanan Jaiswal. I used to be in State Bank of India, took a retirement, and I'm a social activist now. Well, my question is this, that, what kind of foreign policy initiatives should India take to prevent China from attacking us and reclaim, as it says, its South Tibet, which is our Arunachal Pradesh?
Okay, one more question, that lady there.
I'm Yashashree Soman. I work with the Ministry of Human Resource Development. It was presumed a few years ago that India and China were the rising economic superpowers, but in the last 2 years, India has lost its rung and gone on the lines with Brazil, and China still maintains that. What is your opinion on the economy, in the Chinese economy? Is it still going to be maintaining its status of a rising superpower, economic superpower, especially in South Asian politics?
Okay, so you have 2 questions relating to the Chinese economy, one on the foreign policy side and one with respect to India-China. Please.
Okay.
Very simple questions.
On the economy, I feel a bit humbled here because one of the best papers I've read recently on the problems with the Chinese economy is by my associate here, pointing out some of the questions of whether China can sustain its continuing growth. And in general, you get the positive, the optimists in the United States, some of them really from Wall Street or alumni from Wall Street, writing that China can keep going on and on and on and on, that all questions about a slowdown or a meltdown are exaggerated. What the critique of that scenario is come from economists who write about the growing level of Chinese debt. That over the past few years, China and its entities have accumulated so much debt that they may not be able to continue as they have. I would say that the critics, who are often economists, seem to have the best of the argument to me. On China and is it India and the United States?
Chinese, if China's political system is not liberalizing, and yet it is accumulating economic and military power, what does this mean in terms of its relationship with the countries in the region, Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I think for several reasons that to the extent that it does not liberalize politically, that creates at least the underpinnings for a more assertive policy, both to show people at home and because the party has to deal with the army and so on. It needs to show successes. I thought you were, at first I thought you were going to ask the reverse, because sometimes in the United States, in the context of arguments about democracy in China, some of the old China hands who kind of like things the way they always were say, oh, what's so great about a democratic China? China's foreign policy will not be any different if China were democratic. And that's an interesting point that in the context of those arguments, it's sort of irrelevant, because the people who would like China to be to liberalize its system, it's for the benefit of Chinese people, not because of us. I think the point is correct that China's foreign policy would not be problem-free if its political system changed. There would still be plenty of problems and lots, or maybe more, nationalism.
And India, China, any advice for how India should
I think
approach
that
China?
would be presumptuous. I mean, you know, from my own perspective on American policy, I think that you don't want to be lulled by all the old bromides of, oh, you're hurting the Chinese people. That you reflect and push as assertively as possible your own interests and your own views of what the neighborhood should be like, without kind of buying into the Chinese mindset. And you know, I just read in the newspaper, I think it was today, as the Prime Minister is about to go to China, it was, I think, in one of China's nationalist newspapers, someone said, well, we think that India should not raise problems with the Brahmaputra.
Stay here, you will get a sense of how India looks at
Right.
China, and see how, you know, in terms of our perspectives on the developments in the region, we can have more exchanges of the kind that we have had this evening. Thank you very much indeed, and I hope that you have a very pleasant and rewarding stay with us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for good questions.